You're listening to Shoe In, covering the ins and outs of all things footwear, from sneakers to heels, loafers to slippers, and every type of shoe in between. Brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. And now your footwear insiders, Matt Priest and Andy Polk.
Now, I'm not a COVID expert. I haven't had COVID. Yeah. I've gotten my shot. I wear my mask. I'm not an infectious disease expert, but I trust doctors and I trust the science, Matt. And I trust family. Not all family members. Some family members.
Who remain nameless.
But on today's episode, we just recently had a super important briefing from your brother about COVID and specifically about how COVID and the variants may impact consumers, consumer behavior, and what the holiday season looks like this year. Really important conversation. Maybe you can just tee it up really quickly about your brother and about the conversation.
Yeah, man. So Dr. David Priest, my brother, he's Senior Vice President of Safety, Quality, and Epidemiology at Novant Health. He's also an infectious disease doctor. He's become a staple. Who knew this, Andy? Like 5 years ago, I thought my brother would become a staple of communication for our members, but that's kind of where we are today. So he joined us for our fall briefing on COVID and answered a ton of questions as to all the things that you just outlined. So with that, we want to turn this over to the audio version of that conversation. And our hope is that this is helpful to the industry at large, so people have a better understanding of how to plan and operate and kind of conceptualize where we are in our battle against COVID. So take a listen. So Dave, we did this back in the spring. You've been on our podcast a number of times over the last 2 years talking about COVID. A lot has happened. We seem to be more educated as a scientific community, as a society, but it seems like we're still in the midst of what is going to be a long pandemic. Want to welcome you to our conversation, but also provide you an opportunity to provide an update and some opening comments. And then I have a few questions on my end, and then we can launch into the questions that we receive from the audience. So welcome to the Footwear Association's webinar on COVID. Thanks for doing this, and look forward to hearing what your updates are.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me again. Yeah, I thought when our careers cross, it might just be around athlete's foot or something, but this is much more serious than that. So I'll make a few opening comments, just things I think people might be interested in to maybe just set the agenda and the table, and then certainly welcome whatever questions people have. We've certainly been dealing with this for about 19 months now. But in terms of the current COVID state, just as a review, the death total in the United States right now around COVID is about 675,000 people. That's now similar to the 1918 influenza pandemic, although there's some key differences. So if you do what I do for a living and you're in the epidemiology world and you're in infectious disease, you talk about 1918 Spanish flu with kind of this reverence of like, this is the pandemic to remember and review and understand. And so we're kind of come up beside the 1918 pandemic in many ways. And so surprisingly, remember though, in 1918, the U.S. population was about a third of the population that it is today. And during the flu pandemic in 1918, about 1 in 152 Americans died. And during the COVID pandemic right now, we're about 1 out of every 500 Americans have died. So while the overall number of deaths is similar, it was certainly a higher percentage of the population in 1918. We do have individual states now that have more deaths from COVID than people who died during the Vietnam War. I can also tell you the United States represents about 14% of worldwide fatalities, while only having about 4.2% of the global population related all related to COVID. So we distance ourselves and have more deaths than we represent in the population of the world. And the reasons for that include our aging population as well as comorbidities that are very prevalent, including diabetes and particularly obesity. That's been a real risk factor for bad outcomes related to COVID in the entire pandemic. I'll comment a little bit about the Delta variant. The dominant strain I think everyone's aware of COVID currently in the United States is the Delta variant. There's some other, the Mu variant and others are out there, but that's the one that over 90% of cases are from. It's far more contagious, which has really driven this fourth wave of the pandemic. We had a much lighter kind of June and July related to COVID than we've had August and September. And remember, early in the pandemic, we may have even said it on one of these calls, if you had alpha variant COVID last year, you generally might infect 2 or 3 people around you. But this variant, when you get it, you might infect 5 or 10 people around you because there are much higher viral loads in the nasopharynx of individuals who have it. And that's led to some younger individuals getting COVID and some more serious illness and some people getting sick much more quickly. About a fourth of COVID cases are now seen in children under the age of 18 as we've had reopened schools in parts of the country that were not open last year. And despite those high numbers, the number of hospitalized children remains pretty low, certainly relative to adults. But hospitalized children are out there and does occur, including those who get multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, which you've heard about that, which is kind of an autoimmune inflammatory response of multiple organs in response to the virus. So while we have a lot of childhood cases out there, thankfully the complication rate for the most part is not very high. When we do have children in the hospital, they often also have comorbidities and also can have obesity, just like in adults. In our health system, Novant Health, we have 15 hospitals. We have over 600 ambulatory sites. We have about 35,000 team members. In the last few weeks, we've seen a slow, steady trend down in the number of patients in our hospitals over the last couple of weeks. So some good news there. I'll tell you that some of that is because we are seeing lower positivity rates of tests in our communities. But some of that's also from increasing deaths. So in the last few weeks, we've had a night in one of our hospitals where we had 12 patients die in one night, and another hospital we had 7 die in one night. So we do think that it's coming down in the community, but sometimes our hospital census unfortunately goes down because people are dying. The average age of someone admitted to our hospitals right now with COVID in September is about 59 years old. There were points in August where our average age was in the 40s, but now it's about 59 years old. And our mortality rate on admitted patients is about 16%. So if you're admitted to COVID at one of our hospitals in September, that your mortality rate's about 16%. It's been lower at different points in the pandemic, but it's gone back up with the Delta variant. Patients that have to go on a ventilator have a mortality rate of about 55% in the month of September for us. So as this Delta variants come through, if you get admitted to the hospital and you're on a ventilator, you've got about a 50-50 chance of surviving. Our treatments for COVID are not silver bullets. We're still using remdesivir, steroids, monoclonal antibodies. People may have questions about that, particularly for outpatients. We also use some anti-inflammatory agents like tocilizumab. These are drugs that are used in other settings like rheumatoid arthritis or other inflammatory conditions that may have benefit in these patients. It's much better, obviously, to avoid getting COVID in the first place than having to take your chances with our limited therapies right now. And the way you do that, of course, is vaccination. So vaccination does remain highly effective in preventing hospitalization and death. So in our healthcare system, at Novant Health and our 15 hospitals right now, 88 to 90% of the hospitalized patients with COVID are unvaccinated. And there was a point yesterday with 100% of the patients we had in the ICU and 100% of the patients on the ventilator were unvaccinated. Today, I think it's one. I think we have one ICU patient that's had gotten a vaccine and everybody else is unvaccinated. If you are vaccinated and you have to get admitted to the hospital, in general, those patients are older than age 72. They have multiple comorbidities. They were vaccinated, early in the pandemic. So the reverse is true, right? If you're younger and healthier and you were vaccinated more recently, the chances you would be hospitalized with COVID are nil. So if you do get COVID, it may present as a flu-like illness or an upper respiratory infection, but in general, nothing more serious than that. Some people say, well, I don't want to get the vaccine because it doesn't work. I still might get COVID. But if you get COVID, your cases are much more mild and generally don't require hospitalization. The pandemic basically remains a pandemic of the unvaccinated, spilling over onto the vulnerable vaccinated. And where we are, we're based in North Carolina, but we've had facilities in Virginia and other parts of the Southeast. It's really running through communities that are unvaccinated at alarming rates. So it's often in rural counties around us with kind of social, political, and sometimes religious pressures. Some states like Idaho are really struggling right now and having to consider rationing healthcare by deciding who will be treated. I can tell you our healthcare system has an ethics committee that's been involved throughout the course of the pandemic, and that they help us make decisions. If in fact we did get to the point we had limited resources and had to choose some patients over others, how would we do that in an ethical way? Thankfully, we've not had to do that. Our challenges aren't necessarily having enough supplies or ventilators or room. Our challenge is often staffing. So we feel very good about the supplies we have and our ability to respond to the patients that come. Currently, recommendations for a third dose of vaccine, which you may have found to be very confusing, as have we, is a few weeks ago, the ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices from CDC, recommended a third dose of Moderna or Pfizer for those who are highly immunosuppressed, like you're getting active cancer treatment, or you're taking immunosuppressing medications, or you have uncontrolled HIV. That was the only guidance. There hasn't been any guidance yet for Johnson & Johnson vaccination boosters, which has been frustrating for people who got that vaccine. We think we may receive guidance as early as today from the ACIP or tomorrow on recommendations for a third dose in other select individuals, including those over the age of 65, maybe those with their medical conditions, and those in high-risk jobs like healthcare. In general, the vaccines, like I mentioned, are holding up really well. And I would say a broad guideline for everyone is right now a third dose is probably not needed if you're younger and you're otherwise healthy and you were vaccinated in the last few months. The third dose is not something you should be too worried about. Remember, these are just third doses of existing vaccines. They're not actually geared toward the Delta variant, but we know that having higher antibody levels can be more protective. I do anticipate what I would call a true booster will come out in 2022. Think of this as really the third dose in a primary vaccination series. If any of you have gotten vaccines, to say years ago for hepatitis B or something, those vaccine series were 3 doses. I would consider this current one kind of a primary vaccination series. And I think in the spring we'll have a booster that's specifically geared toward Delta or other variants. We have mandated vaccines in our healthcare system. I know that's a hot topic no matter what industry you're in, particularly ours. I can speak to our experience on that, and perhaps that will help some of you who are trying to work through some of those things. I know my industry is different than yours, so I don't anticipate that all these would apply to you, but you might find something valuable in those. We're currently at a compliance rate of about 99% in our healthcare system. 100% of our physicians are vaccinated or have a medical or religious exemption. We're one of the earlier healthcare systems to get there, although Houston Methodist in Houston was really early. They got to this number in the spring. And for us, compliant means you're fully vaccinated or you've gotten 1 dose by our first date or you have a medical or religious exemption. So those who have not been in compliance in recent days are suspended and then ultimately will be terminated if they don't get in compliance. And we have about 35,000 team members and just a small couple hundred now that are not compliant. So as you're aware, the Biden administration's announced a vaccine mandate for companies that have more than 100 employees, and you all will know much better than I about how to deal with that and where you are. But a few things I would tell you as someone who just went through the deadline in healthcare, and take it or leave any of these comments or pieces of advice. Number one, what I've learned through all this is you got to over communicate. I feel like I say the same thing over and over again on multiple calls and emails and webinars and all this. And I do say the same thing over and over again. And despite the fact that we have hundreds of ways to communicate with each other now, the message doesn't always get through. And sometimes it just doesn't sink in with people for much of the time, or they're just not paying attention. So we've had to communicate. And even at the end of the day, people say, I didn't hear about this, or the doctor's the worst. And I can say that because I am one. They'll say, well, just email me. Well, they don't read the emails. So you have to get at it in a lot of different ways. Short of me going to their homes and having dinner with them every night to tell them what's happening, it's really hard, this kind of push-pull of information and how you get it out there. The other thing I'd say is if you decide you had to mandate at some point, stick to a deadline, get a deadline, stick to it. We had the earliest deadline in our region, and we had some people even internally, when we got some pushback, said, oh, you need to extend it out, but we didn't, and we kind of stuck to our guns, and we're really glad we did. As you can imagine, having a hard deadline and people realizing you're going to stick to it led to a lot of last minute movement on getting vaccinated. And I can tell you the healthcare systems around us have texted me constantly saying, they wish they had done the earlier dates or congratulating us. And, I think some of our team members just didn't think we were going to go through with it. And when they saw that we were, and we took safety of patients really seriously, they got on board. The third thing I would say is do your homework and define medical and religious exemptions carefully. The Biden administration didn't say a lot about those things, and there are not a lot of medical and religious reasons not to be vaccinated. But if you decide to do that, you will get some unusual requests that you had not anticipated or situations. So be prepared to deal with those, really carefully. For us, and I know for you, I'm sure the fourth thing I would say is know your OSHA rules and how to apply them. I don't even pretend to be an expert in how that applies to what you do, but in the healthcare world, OSHA has been actually a little behind in COVID and put out some standards recently that look like they should have come out 18 months ago. They seemed out of date, but we had to adjust to those. So that's been a big lift for us, but we've gotten there. That can be a real challenge. The next thing I would say, if you have exempt team members, and are you going to test them? I don't know that you would. We've had to deal with that. How do you operationalize that? What are the reporting requirements? What are the lab requirements? How do you get the testing kits that are hard to get a hold of? Are you compensating team members for the time it takes to get immunized and tested? Those are all things we think about in healthcare and might apply to some of you. The sixth thing I would say is be prepared with important scientific facts to counteract misinformation. That's going to be sent to you regarding vaccine side effects, how the vaccines were developed, the reason that team members can't be tested because they say they're carcinogens and swabs and all those things. There's a lot of that, and you have to kind of work through it. And sometimes it's a very small number of people, but they're often the loudest, and you have to kind of deal with what they're throwing at you. And then finally, I would say weather the storm. You're going to deal with threatening emails and harassment like we did. And again, a very small number of people. There's kind of this silent majority supporting us in healthcare to get people vaccinated, because we can't, in my world, we can't have people come into our hospitals that we give COVID to and it kills them. I mean, it's just unacceptable. So, and I'll finish with just a few things. The challenges for our industry, and maybe some of the challenges for you. Healthcare fatigue is a real thing. Nurses are tired, doctors are tired, and there's kind of what we call compassion fatigue. People went into healthcare for the right reasons a lot of the time, but when they've seen yet another person in the ER who probably doesn't need to be there, if they had been vaccinated, that's really frustrating. And so we have mental health challenges among our team members and staff, and making sure we're supporting them and giving time off and letting them get away from it all. So that's a difficult thing we have to work through. We also have hard times with healthcare worker staffing. We were already had shortages in staffing before the pandemic, just because there's just nursing shortages in the United States. And we have some that have left because they don't want to be vaccinated. It's not a large number, but it's still people you have to account for. And we have people that have been out sick with COVID before they were vaccinated. We had people out sick. So we have the space and equipment and supplies we need, but we don't always have the people to run those things. The next thing I would say, the pandemic of misinformation. I've said this before, maybe on one of these calls. This is the first pandemic in the age of social media, and it's failed us miserably. Mm-hmm. So I repeatedly encourage team members to get off of social media for their own mental health. Some people can be on there and not be affected from a mental health standpoint. I'm not one of them, so I'm not on it. I'm on LinkedIn. That's about it. And I don't know how people deal with it, but it really drives a lot of angst. And we also know that a lot of social media has been driven by people outside the United States that spread misinformation. So, we're still wrestling with kind of misinformation around particular drugs, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, vaccine misinformation. All of that is a challenge for us. And, someone the other day sent me a poster that was a kind of an anti-vaccine poster. And at the top of it said, the vaccine will kill children. And it was this whole kind of thing, about how vaccine was bad. And then I actually looked at the fine print on the poster, and it was from 1955. And it was actually geared toward the polio pandemic. Mm. And I asked my parents, hey, do you remember people saying don't get polio vaccine? And they said no. And I said, because there was no social media. Mm-hmm. And so I think social media has been a problem. And so I think we can learn things through the polio pandemic as well. So those are just some early thoughts, some things we've wrestled with. Hopefully some of that's of use to you. I'm happy to help with the conversation going forward here.
Yeah, no, that's super, super helpful, Dave. I've got a couple of things I want to ask. We've got a question in the Q&A box. Keep them coming if you have questions as we go down this road. A couple of questions from my own personal perspective, Dave. I've read or heard that these waves are like typically kind of 2-month waves. If you look at the Delta variant in India, it was 2 months, a rise and fall, a spike, and then a decline. Is that something that it looks like is happening here? And is that the same with all the spikes, or is it just Delta? How should we, and whatever comes next, is it always kind of this 2-month ramp up and then a decline?
Yeah, it just depends, right? And that's I'm not trying to be evasive. It depends on the time of year and the number of people vaccinated in your community and the particular variant. I can tell you that pandemic modeling is a real art. We actually have internal models that take into account a number of factors, and we try to predict what's going to happen in our different markets in the next 2 weeks. And so people smarter than me have come up with mathematical equations to try to figure that out. They're not perfect, but they help. And I can tell you the latest kind of national modeling is suggesting, and it could change tomorrow, we learn a lot every day, is suggesting that we should probably see a continued decline as we're starting to see kind of going toward March. Those models are not predicting a big winter spike. We'll have influenza and that'll be around. And I think they're anticipating we'll see some uptake of vaccine in children, which we anticipate some of that approval will come in October. And so as some children get vaccinated and more people have just had COVID and many more people have been vaccinated, it'll still be here. It'll still be endemic. We'll be dealing with it, but that we may hit a new low point in March. So I'm actually encouraged by that. I know it sounds like it's a long way off. If this continues on a downward trajectory slowly, and we see vaccines are still holding up and they're still protecting people, and then I think that's probably what we're going to see. So if you look at our models, each spike's a little different. It depends on the market, the population there, right? We have markets where the population is a bit older. There's a retirement area there. We have markets where we have higher numbers of our Hispanic patients. We have markets, we have other people that are more rural. And so the spikes, the durations, all that varies a little bit. So there are other variants out there right now. We don't have any evidence they're going to be any worse than Delta at this point, and that's to be expected. We're looking for variants. We're just hoping we don't get one that totally eludes vaccine. And I don't think that's what's going to happen over the next few months, but we're going to have to watch it carefully. And, I think COVID is just going to be around. Every year we have flu, and every year you have COVID, and you may get a COVID shot every year like you get a flu shot.
Let me ask you about antibody treatments. The Washington Post did a story, 2 or 3 weeks ago, clearly not a bastion of conservative conspiracy, but talked about how important these antibody treatments are. They're free. And at the time of publication, only about 600,000 Americans had access to them, and how they boost your antibodies, and how the Biden administration hasn't really pushed them because there's been a strong desire to get everyone vaccinated. Can you talk more about the efficacy of the antibody treatments? I've had a number of people in my life, professionally and personally, get COVID and then get injections of the antibodies, and they seem to be quote unquote a miracle drug. So how do you kind of approach the use of antibodies as an effective tool?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we as an organization do give it. I'll tell you that the antibodies change over time. So remember how these are created. So the first one was banlanivimab. And those antibodies are created, someone gets COVID, and then their antibody response is taken from their plasma and analyzed, and then more of those antibodies are made essentially synthetically. And so we use them. I know people will say miracle drug. That has not been my experience. In fact, we've submitted a paper for publication on banlanivimab from earlier in the pandemic, where we didn't see it make a big difference. It doesn't mean it doesn't work or doesn't help, but I think if it's framed in my view, my experience, I think these are useful tools, but I don't think they're framed as if only all these people had gotten monoclonal antibody, no one would have ended up in the hospital. It's not as simple as that. So what happens over time, though, is as different variants come, the monoclonal antibodies have to change, right? Because they're made from responses to previous variants. So the alpha variant comes out, somebody gets COVID, their body makes antibodies. Scientists took that antibody from the patient, synthetically made versions of it, called it banlanivimab. It ends in mab, that stands for monoclonal antibody. So anything ends in mab is a monoclonal antibody. They take that, they basically make more of it, and they put it in a bag, and you get COVID, they give it to you. Now, remember, the EUA on monoclonal antibody is really geared towards specific types of patients. So it's not necessarily for everybody. A young person who has a mild case of COVID isn't necessarily a candidate for monoclonal antibody. We try to stick with the emergency use authorizations for those products. So over age 65, other comorbidities, obesity, diabetes. A lot of Americans fall into those categories. A lot of Americans qualify, but not everybody. And so we use those tools. There have been various other antibody concoctions that come through, Regeneron, which President Trump got at one point. We still use that. We have another banlanivimab Etsy combo that we call that we give. And so there are important tools. You want to try to get those earlier in the course. Because if you give them later, the cat may be out of the bag in terms of treatment. So we occasionally will give them in the hospital, not always in special clinical situations. So my advice to patients is, and we've been writing for it for a long time. The first one I ever wrote for was on Christmas Day, 2020. So if you are somebody who meets the criteria for high risk of having complications related to COVID and you get COVID, you should talk to your doctor about monoclonal antibody infusion. And it's how we administer it's a challenge, right? Because we have infusion centers in our hospitals that are designed to give people things in their vein: cancer patients, rheumatology patients, infection patients. But now you have to find a place where people with COVID can go, who aren't going to infect all of those people. And so you have to have special units to do that. So hospital systems struggled a little bit with trying to figure out where to put people. It's not a substitute for vaccination. Now, if you've been vaccinated and you get COVID and you meet EUA criteria for monoclonal antibody, you can still give it to those people. But I can tell you where the supply may get low. And I saw this week, state of Tennessee is considering only giving monoclonal antibody to people who get COVID or unvaccinated or vaccinated and very vulnerable. So I think supply may get to be an issue in the coming weeks as well.
I want to hit on a couple cultural things, and then we've got a number of questions that have come in, so we'll get right to those. First and foremost, as you look at video of the Wisconsin football game, the Alabama football game, Florida, you see these groups of people coming together in large gatherings, unmasked, outdoors. And you kind of think through kind of what's happening across the U.S. Clearly, a large portion, both red and blue states, are clearly over this thing and ready to get back to life. In fact, I even heard Bill Maher talk about he likes traveling and touring, even as a liberal, doing shows in red states because he knows that people are more relaxed about coming to see him, and he makes a living off that. But as a doctor, when you see that at this stage in the pandemic, are you mortified? Are you relieved? Somewhere in the middle? Kind of how do you digest how the American public is starting to get back out there and do things that we've longed to do for the last 19 months?
Yeah, so all this is about degrees of risk, right? So I think, as we've said for a long time now, as we learn more and more about the virus, what you can do or can't do depends on your acceptance of risk. And we know that doing things outside is certainly much safer, right? So if you're in an outside event, the wind's really blowing, there's good airflow, you're able to space out, you've been vaccinated, that's a reasonably safe situation. 100,000 people at a football game, if I'm vaccinated and I'm otherwise healthy and I'm outside and the wind's blowing, there is some degree of risk that I will get COVID there, but my chances of doing well or having a mild case are really high. If I'm currently a cancer patient, or I'm older, or I have obesity or diabetes, then I got to think twice, about being in those settings. So I think it's about being smart and knowing yourself and knowing what your risks are, and then deciding how to manage those risks. Obviously, being inside for longer periods of time with more people, with less airflow, or unmasked and unvaccinated, that's the most dangerous place, right? So, bars with a bunch of unvaccinated people, trying to talk to each other over loud music, much more dangerous than a football game or a concert that's being held outside. And I went to an outside concert recently, and we were a few of us masked there. And I masked not because I was fearful of what COVID might happen to me, but I don't think I was going to die from COVID if I got it, but it really disrupts my life, right? I got to be out of work for 10 days. And so it was just saying, you know what, I'm willing to have people look at me like I'm nuts wearing a mask of this thing because of what I do for a living. And but I do think there are ways to do some of the things you enjoy without restricting yourself too much. But be cautious and get vaccinated. That's the most important thing. Is if you're not vaccinated, all those things are much more dangerous.
Last question I have, and someone's trolling. NC State football game is safe. It's never packed. Thanks, Andy Polk. Go Wolfpack. Let's talk about religious exemptions really quick, and both the ones that you've seen come in, and if companies then move to mandate vaccines in some way and become an arbiter of what a religious exemption is, that'll be difficult to do, I suspect. I don't think there's any Christian denomination. We're both church-going dudes. There's no Christian denomination that's come out and said that a religious exemption is scriptural, if you will. But while at the same time, I know there are concerns. Half the population has a pro-life posture, so there are concerns about how these vaccines were derived from potentially aborted cells from the 60s and 70s. So how would you advise companies to kind of step into this morass of varying degrees of views from a religious and political perspective?
Yeah, good luck to all of you if you can figure that out. We wrestled with it. So I think, and this is just one person's view. So I think medical ethics are really, really important. I'll preface all of that by saying it. I do think when we look at medical health ethics in healthcare, we had to think through, what does that mean? And if there's a hierarchy of ethics in healthcare, what's at the tippy top? And what are other things that have to become kind of subservient to that? And for us, preventing patient death is number one, right? It comes before our own personal autonomy, it comes before my autonomy, it comes my choice about vaccine, all of that. So I think we had to say as an organization, what is our philosophy on medical ethics? They're very important, but they're not all equal. Not every ethical principle and my autonomy doesn't outweigh preventing someone else's death. So we had to establish that first. And then we had to say, okay, but we live in a country where we're supposed to have freedom. Where does one line end and one line begin? And what's the autonomy of the team member? And how can we accommodate those things? And so we had a committee that's made up of chaplains. We have a lot of resources for this. Some other groups may not have this already built in, but we already have a committee of ethics folks and chaplains and physicians and others to kind of ponder all of this. And of course, lawyers, right? So from the legal standpoint.
In that order, chaplains, physicians, lawyers, right?
And no comment. But we had to work through that. And so, the law says, at least in our world, that a deeply held religious belief should be accommodated where possible. And the question is, how do you define that? And to your point, many large religious organizations, the Pope himself said it was okay to do this. A lot of people suddenly found God. And we had to work through that. And we had to work through what seemed like a deeply held religious belief that we tried to honor. If it's somebody who, we have an influenza vaccine program too. So we do this every year. We get a little handful of folks who say they don't want it. So if we got an exemption request from somebody who for years has gotten an exemption request for the flu shot, it seems pretty consistent with how they live and their belief system. And we have to honor that.
Right.
If we got people who are vaping and in the fast food line at McDonald's and doing those things, and now they suddenly don't want the shot, it doesn't seem quite as genuine, or it seems a little disingenuous, but it's really hard to interpret that. So if they were able to articulate something that was a deeply held belief, and it seemed reasonable, we had to really think through that. And there are some organizations that ask for letters from your rabbi or your priest or your minister or that kind of thing. We didn't do that. We're not here to be punitive. We're here to try to protect people. And we said, okay, if we give you this religious exemption, you're going to be tested every week, and you're going to have to wear an N95 mask at all times. And we wear N95 masks. We wear masks for everything, but N95 specifically for some procedures and some settings. But they're going to have to wear it all the time. And the ones who said, that's okay, we'll do that. And that's what we started on, this week was those folks are getting tested. So it's a hard thing to navigate. I think we try to be respectful for, you don't want to wash out all the people who have real genuinely held beliefs, because there's some dodgers in there, and some probably slid through. There's no doubt. But I didn't want to harm the folks who really had true belief systems that they were working off of in the process, or just dismiss that out of hand. And we have a very strong diversity and inclusion program in our organization. We have for a long time, and doesn't seem like a very inclusive thing to kind of wash all those people overboard. We have found, I think, that some of those folks who probably got fairly soft religious exemptions have started to change their mind and get vaccinated. So we're kind of sticking with it and working through that. And you have to make those decisions on your own, but it is not very easy to judge the motives. Now, some people send in religious exemptions that said, I won't get it if it's not FDA approved. Well, that was our end, because when it became FDA approved the week after, we said, okay, religious exemption revoked, because you said you'd get it if it was FDA approved. or, they said if they put political language into it, like the Constitution says this or whatever, we say, well, that's not a deeply held religious belief. So we didn't accept all of them. We had to work through that. And that, of course, sparked some conversations.
I'm sure, to put it lightly. All right. We got a lot to go through, so let's get to it. Should the third dose be the same as the first doses, or is it okay to get Pfizer if the first round was Moderna? Can you mix and match the vaccines?
Yeah, really good question. So the guidance now is to try to get what you got before. Now, if it's you totally can't, or somehow that all the Moderna went away and that's what you got, you can mix products. What we're seeing right now is that Pfizer and Moderna both seem to work pretty well. Moderna probably works a little bit better in just preventing all cases of COVID. You would preferentially get a Moderna over a Pfizer, but we try to stick with that same product when there's available product out there.
Got it. If you are vaccinated and then had breakthrough COVID and have high antibodies, does that make you any more immune?
Yeah, another good question. I would say the answer is yes. Essentially, you basically got another dose of vaccine with the virus itself. And so that's I think the case. We get the same question sometimes is you get the first dose and before you get the second, you get COVID. Now what do I do? And so in general, we've told people wait a couple of weeks and then get the second dose as scheduled, or the second dose is scheduled. So now you've had had COVID and got the second dose. I also get the question along those lines is I've had COVID. We had this in our team members. Don't make me get vaccinated because I had COVID. And there's a study out of Israel that says, hey, maybe natural immunity is better than vaccine. But there are some other studies that suggest not everybody who's had COVID makes an antibody. So you're going to check all their antibodies and try to sort that out. So my view is that while we've told people you've had COVID, you still have to be vaccinated. We may eventually get data that says if you've had COVID, you only need one dose of vaccine. You essentially got your first exposure. We just haven't had that yet. And I understand the pushback on that. Like I had a bad case of COVID and here's a lab test that shows I have antibodies and why are you making me do this? I get that. But when CDC still suggests it, we pushed forward with vaccinating those folks.
All right. Let's see. If COVID virus dies out or is not transmissible after about 7 to 10 days, how long would one infected with COVID still experience symptoms after that 10-day period?
Yeah, so that's tricky because most people recover kind of in a couple of weeks, but you've all probably heard of long COVID. So in the infectious disease world that I live in, we've known for a long time that there are some infections, particularly viral infections, that when people get them, the virus may no longer be there within 10 days or something, but it causes some kind of immune dysregulation. That sounds like a really vague term because it is a really vague term about what that means, where people don't feel good for a long period of time. Think about the college kid who gets mono in September and then is just so wiped out, they got to leave for the semester and come back in the spring. There are those things happen, and long COVID is probably in that category. Now, not everybody gets it, but there are people who said, I've got fatigue and brain fog and I don't feel good and I'm having all these strange symptoms, sometimes for months after COVID. Another reason to get vaccinated is you don't want long COVID. So it's variable. Most people recover in a couple of weeks. Some people can have things that go on and on and on. And we don't have great answers or treatments for those. Occasionally treat those people with steroids that sometimes help. Occasionally people have said, I got COVID. I felt like I was having long COVID symptoms, and then I got vaccinated and it made me feel better. That's a little anecdotal, but that can happen. So it's a long answer to a short question, but symptoms can vary. Most people better in a couple of weeks, but some can go a long time. It doesn't mean they're contagious. It just means whatever immune dysregulation and inflammatory state they're in now is causing them to not feel well.
Got it. Let's see. This person just had their yearly physical with their Cleveland Clinic doctor. They had the antibody test ordered by their doctor, and based on those tests concluded that this person had the antibodies for COVID. They never had symptoms, never even knew that this person had it. Doctor says that natural immunity is better than vaccine-imposed immunity. We kind of got to this, but vaccine was not recommended at this time. How come there's no talk about natural immunity? Which is, you kind of spoke to it, but maybe you can put a finer point on it.
Yeah, so I think there is some talk about natural immunity. Marty McCary likes to write for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. He's on some of the national networks, and he really rings this bell. He's at Johns Hopkins. I've met him before. Really smart guy. And if you're interested in an interesting book about healthcare, he wrote one called The Price We Pay. It's a great book. And he's a great guy, and he's talking about that as well. I think the concern about natural immunity is how potentially uneven it is. So while some studies suggest natural immunity may be better than vaccines, there are others that said a third of the people with COVID in this cohort didn't make an antibody. So I think that's part of it. I think to Dr. McCary's point, he would say, we're going to get to herd immunity sooner than we think because of all the people that have had it, even if they're not vaccinated. But, there were some predictions made that we would get to herd immunity in April. And because of that concept, and it's September, and we're not there. So I think there's a lot to learn on it. I think that natural immunity has a lot of value, and it may turn out that in some people who get enough of an immune response to it that it's perfectly protective. We just don't know that. And you can't get COVID more than once. So I think it's reasonable.
Say that again. You can get COVID more than once.
You can get COVID more than once.
People saying you can't get it more than once, so you can get more than once.
Yeah, especially as these variants come through. And I would say that if you want to prevent yourself from getting it again, I would consider being vaccinated. Now, at one point, CDC said if you've had COVID, you can wait 90 days before you're vaccinated. And I think that's still pretty legit, but you don't have to wait that long. So if you've got other comorbidities, consider getting vaccinated, sooner than 90 days after your case.
Sure. What would you tell young adults that claim they would rather take the chance of getting COVID and get natural antibodies instead of getting vaccinated? Again, all the same kind of general questions, but what's your elevator speech to a young kid who's like, yeah, I'll rather get it and not deal with the vaccine?
Yeah, so I understand that. I think it's, people at that age think they're invincible, right? And for the most part, they're going to do well. I think the things you can anticipate are what are the unusual side effects that people get from COVID itself, right? So occasionally a young person without comorbidities dies. There's a tragic case of an emergency department nurse in Louisiana who was kind of an online, anti-vaxxer, I'll say, told people don't get vaccinated. And she worked in the emergency department in a hospital in Louisiana, and she died of COVID, 23 years old, no comorbidity. So it's rare, but it does happen. It's just like influenza. It's rare, but it does happen, although the mortality rate is much higher for COVID than influenza. So I would say that by getting vaccinated, you're protecting yourself from the rare chance that something serious could happen. You're protecting yourself from long COVID. And you're also protecting the people around you. So if you're going to go visit your grandmother, could you bring COVID to your grandmother and not know it? Or you have, it depends on who you're around and all those kind of things as well. So vaccines aren't perfect. There are things to think through. I think if you're a young person and you have other comorbidities, then you still want to be thinking about getting vaccinated. And the more people vaccinated, the better it'll be for all of us. But I certainly understand the sentiment.
And this is a question that's just kind of popped in my head. And I want to do a fair job, knowing that we represent a diverse group of people with different ideas and experiences and backgrounds. And so this is probably a question that people have thought of on how the media portrays COVID. You mentioned the smallpox campaign, the poster that you mentioned. Was it smallpox?
Polio.
And there was no social media at the time. At the same time, are we too connected in the sense that hearing about the 23-year-old woman in Louisiana who gets it and dies becomes this thing that we internalize and then go and do something? Again, I'm fully vaccinated. I'll share that. And so I'm very supportive of it. But are we too connected? Are we hearing these stories that are driving anxiety more than it deserves, or is this like the legit thing? And I don't want to downplay it, but I also want to represent the views of people who probably are kind of just tired of being connected to everyone and hearing every single death story that's out there.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. I think it's a real interest, real window into human psychology, right? So we've got people who don't want to leave their homes ever again because they don't want to get COVID. And then we have other people that deny it even exists. And there's some bell-shaped curve in the middle, right? And look, you're talking to the infectious disease guy who watches, people die in the hospital from COVID. I'm going to have a little different viewpoint. It's a little hard to deny 675,000 dead Americans. Now, you could say, well, they were older, or I don't have those comorbidities. And I think that's certainly true. So I think you try to say, let's be realistic about what's happening here. I do think you can get bombarded with too much stuff. And in this day and age with our polarized electorate and our polarized media, right? I mean, you go to a particular media source now for a particular political slant on both sides. So you're going to get someplace pro this over here and anti this over here. And so, I tell our team members, I mean, I feel like I've been this kind of weird uncle who's kind of try to tell people you can't get too much information. Go to reliable sources, Reuters, AP, like just straight up news things, and look at it periodically and do what's smart, And I think if you're hanging on every COVID story in your feed, you could get this sense of, it's terrible or whatever. It's pretty bad. But I think, again, if you're vaccinated and otherwise pretty healthy, you're going to do fine. I think there's some truth to all that, but just, try to stay away from every media story.
Sure. That's good advice for all of us on everything. All right. More questions. Can you talk a little bit more about how the vaccines prevent the spread of the virus to others? It seems that there are a lot of breakthrough cases. What I'm telling people, and I haven't shared this with you, so you can just tell me if I'm flat out wrong, but let's just say on average, the vaccine in the first quarter of it being given to you is 90%, has a 90% efficacy rate. And you give a vaccine to 200 million people, and 10% could have that's 20 million people that could have potential breakthrough cases if doesn't have the impact that it has. That's a lot of people. So are we seeing what has been told to us as advertised, or is there something else happening on these breakthrough cases that's even more so than what we expected?
Yeah, so I think it's what's expected, right? So the vaccines are designed to keep you out of the hospital and keep you from dying. And you're right, when the denominator is really big, 200 million, 300 million, 400 million people, billions in the world, then a small percentage of that's a lot of people. But again, what we're seeing on the ground is if you get COVID, you're not going to be hospitalized or on the ICU or on a ventilator. It's just holding up everywhere if you're vaccinated. So I think that's the kind of the thing to keep in mind. Now, to the question, there are people who are vaccinated, you can get COVID, right? But what we've seen with Delta variant is if you're vaccinated and you get COVID, the amount of virus that's in your nasopharynx drops off very quickly. So could you make, give it to somebody else as a vaccinated person? Yes, you could. But your window that you're contagious is much shorter than someone who's unvaccinated. So, that kind of as an excuse, hey, you're not going to get, I'm not going to get vaccinated because you can still get it and I can still pass it along. So what's the point? One is going to keep you out of the hospital. Two is if you do get it, your contagious window is much, much shorter. And then for unvaccinated people who may infect 5 or 10 people around them. So there's no perfect vaccine. Remember, every year we do a flu shot. I mean, there are years it's 35% effective. No one, people say that's why I'm not getting it, but other people get it. They say, I'll take my 35%, thanks.
Yeah.
And this is the same way. And to be even 90% effective or 95% effective is incredible. So I think our standards have changed a little bit on what we think is effective and what's worth getting. And I think humans are terrible at estimating risk. I think we don't estimate risk in our everyday lives at all very well. And sometimes the numbers confuse people.
Yeah, for sure. I liken the vaccine to the Paul Revere to your immune system, right? Like the British are coming. This virus is coming. You may still get it. The British may still attack, but you will have battened down the hatches and prepared for something. Your body will be able to withstand it.
Yeah, it's a self-destructing instruction manual for your immune system, right? So that mRNA vaccine, right? And we may have said this before. These vaccines were developed. Remember, years ago, vaccines were viruses or bacteria. We weakened them and then we gave them to you. And then the next step was, we don't need to give you that whole thing. Let's just give you a protein like current flu shots. We'll squeeze some protein out of some viruses and give that to you because that's all your immune system needs. Now it's like, oh, forget that. We'll just give you the instruction manual that'll help your cells in your arm make the protein for about 48 hours. And then that little mRNA just crumbles and disappears, and it's very, very, very fragile. Hence, they got to store vaccine in freezer. So it is like Paul Revere, but it's like Paul Revere showed up and gave you, this message will self-destruct in 48 hours, and then it's gone, and now your immune system is aware of what to look for when the real thing shows up.
Got it. We do have a question about how, if you're an adult, how does one obtain a religious exemption?
Yeah, well, so it would just depend on, the company you work for. For us, it was self-attestation. And they had to lay out what the principles were, right? I believe in this thing, and this is my belief system, and this is why I'm applying that. And occasionally people would put scripture references or all of those kind of things. So it would be kind of how you viewed your personal belief system and where that came from, and then you could express that in the exemption.
Got it. If we have 70% of Americans vaccinated, and we have maybe 20% of Americans with COVID now after the Delta spike, whatever those numbers are, and we're at a point where we have enough antibodies to better protect the general population from another spike in are we at the point where we have enough antibodies to better protect the general population from another spike in hospitalization?
You get it out there.
Yeah, barely.
I hope, right? So to Matt's point earlier about big denominators, right? You can say we got all these people vaccinated, but you might have 80 million people not vaccinated. And those 80 million people sometimes have comorbidities and live in places where no one around them is vaccinated. And it's kind of running through those places. So we hope we're getting to that place. The only thing that could derail us from that, and I think that's what, if these models hold up as we get toward March, we'll be at that point, right? We'll have large number of people vaccinated, number of people either gotten COVID and survived or gotten COVID and died, and a stash of monoclonal antibodies to help people. That we'll get to some point that's being described there. It's probably going to take a few more months. What could derail it is some variant that vaccines didn't held up on, or older infection didn't help. I don't think it's going to come to that, but it could. So hopefully we're getting to that point.
Got it. Have you heard anything about, this is speaking to like the migrant crisis at the border. Have you heard anything regarding the vaccinating immigrants coming across the southern border? If they're dispatched all over the country, are they not and they are not vaccinated, isn't it likely they will be spreading COVID?
Yeah, I don't know what they're doing from a vaccination standpoint. And I think certainly that could be the case. I'll tell you, there are states in the United States that have had the highest COVID rate in the world recently. And I don't think that's all from immigrants. It doesn't mean they couldn't spread COVID, but I think good old red-blooded Americans are driving a lot of this in those states. So to the point, though, I think you have to be careful. You don't want to have people continue to cross borders who have COVID, and there needs to be a plan on how to address that, either vaccinate people or test them. And I'm not sure what they're doing. But I don't personally think that's a major driver of COVID outbreaks in, say, Florida or Texas or Arkansas or North Carolina, where I am. I don't think that's a huge part of it. Doesn't mean it doesn't occur. I just don't think it's a huge part of it.
That goes back to that 80 million unvaccinated number. What's it matter how many are coming across the border if we have unvaccinated people here?
Yeah, it's not helping, but I don't think it's the big driver.
Right. Any tips for company travel and limiting risks? Our industry's back up and there's more and more travel happening. Is flying safe with the Delta variant?
If you're vaccinated and you're masking and the flights are shorter, which I know you guys take long flights sometimes.
Not right now. Everything's shut down where we totally fly. So.
But I think it's reasonably safe, right? I mean, if I had to fly somewhere in the United States and I'm vaccinated and I'm wearing a mask and I'm, maintaining all that and their masking policies, and then I think you can do it. Again, it's managing risk and knowing that it's there's nothing that's 100%. But if I needed to get somewhere important and I was a short flight and I'm vaccinated wearing a mask, I think that can be done safely.
This is one that's popped up over the last year or so. Many young people are concerned the vaccine will affect fertility. Is this the case?
No, and it's popped up a lot. There's absolutely no evidence that this affects fertility at all. And some of that early on came from a paper out of Germany where someone claimed that there were proteins in the placenta that looked like things that the vaccine was going to be, your immune system would respond to in the vaccine. And none of that's proven to be true. In fact, we've seen many cases of women having children and being able to pass on antibodies to their now born children and through lactation and all those kind of things. And we do know that pregnant women in particular can be very vulnerable to COVID as they are to influenza. So we've seen some tragic cases in our healthcare system where pregnant women were not vaccinated and died or lost their babies. So that's a real tragedy. But there's no evidence this affects fertility for men or women. And those rumors float through places. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology have come forward and said, we don't see any evidence of that. In the Pfizer trial in particular, they didn't enroll any pregnant women into the trial, but many became pregnant. I won't say many, a number became pregnant in the trial. And there was no pregnancy loss there was zero complications in the arm of patients who got the real vaccine. There was one miscarriage in the placebo arm and somebody who actually didn't even get the vaccine. So there was no evidence in the Pfizer trials of any harm to pregnancy or fertility. So, and there's not really a scientific mechanism of where that would even be feasible. You can be confident about that.
Yeah. Is there science that shows vaccinated people who get COVID have a lower chance of transmission to others than unvaccinated people who have COVID?
Yeah, and that goes back to that viral, especially with Delta, that viral replication of the nasopharynx. It drops so quickly. You don't have all that virus replicating for a number of days. So, yeah, I would say that's true.
What is the window of being contagious? Is that still kind of that 2 days before showing symptoms, that time frame?
Yeah, roughly. And I think with Delta, when you develop symptoms, you're making a lot of virus. So you're real contagious then, even more than alpha variants. And then generally about 10 days, right? Quarantine is still about a 10-day period. We have people that are immunosuppressed that get COVID. We often quarantine them for 20 days because they can be infectious longer, but the average person will be infectious about 10 days.
Got it. Just a few more. We're coming up on 3:30 on the East Coast, so we'll close out here in just a second. We do have a couple questions on vaccines for kids under 12. Any new info on vaccines for kids under 12? And another question: what is the realistic timeline for vaccine approval in younger children? So that's even further under 12 infants and toddlers, given FDA regulations.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from Pfizer is that you may see some approval for kids ages 5 to 11 in October. That seems to be the timeline they're on. In fact, I've got their super secret document on my desk right now. So we think that's what's going to be the case. I think for kids younger than that, I would think after the first of the year in that age group. But I think ages 5 to 11 for Pfizer, probably in October is what the thought is.
Got it. 2 more questions and we'll call it a day. Is there still an issue of locality to get the vaccination? Is availability different between cities and rural communities? For example, what percentage of the 80 million have poor access? Can you get the vaccine anywhere you go in the U.S.?
Yeah, pretty much. And that's a really important question, though, because it seems like, oh, yeah, of course, there's a lot of vaccine, and there is. But it comes down to making sure, and we've tried to do this in our organization, equitable distribution of vaccine, right? Especially when it first came out. We just can't give it to the rich folks in town or the zip codes where there's money and healthcare, and not the zip codes where there's not. So we've tried to really focus on that. How do we get in all communities so there's equitable distribution of vaccine? And to the point there is, are there rural areas where we serve that people don't have access to vaccine? Right now, I think it's pretty readily available. CVS and Walgreens and most places have it. But it's a very important question as we think about these kind of big vaccine rollouts. And we knew early on that the rich people were cutting the line, right? And that's not right. We can't do that.
Yeah, for sure. Last question. Will health insurance companies ever deny coverage or raise rates for individuals who don't get vaccinated?
I think they will raise rates. I don't know that they'll deny coverage, although occasionally you hear this kind of the pseudo, kind of worry about, you hear some doctor in some place is saying, I won't see patients that are unvaccinated. And occasionally pediatricians over the years have said, well, our practice only sees vaccinated kids. I don't think you'll see any kind of denial of coverage for care or any widespread healthcare workers saying we won't care for patients who are unvaccinated. But I think you will see, it's like if you charge a higher premium for smokers, you're going to do it for unvaccinated people because, you know, if you have diabetes and obesity and you're 60 years old and you're in a high COVID area, you're going to cost that company, you know, the insurance company knows you're going to cost them more. So they may raise your premium. I can certainly see that happening.
Well, if humans don't do a good job in, kind of analyzing risk, insurance companies definitely do. So
yeah, they know the numbers a lot better than I do. Right.
Yeah. So, well, Dave, I can't thank you enough. It's 3:30. You committed an hour to us. I know you're so busy. I know you're working really hard. I know there's a lot of fatigue with you and your colleagues. I want to thank you on behalf of our industry for being available to us to answer these questions. I'm getting a number of kind of notes directed at me, just saying how this has been very succinct and the clearest explanation that anyone's heard during the pandemic. So thank you. And stay strong, my friend, my brother, and thanks for coming on. I really do appreciate it. So, Andy, as you can see, great conversation, lots of information. There's a lot of variables. There's a lot of things that are changing on the fly, but being flexible. Maximum flexibility is always key in this environment. So I think my hope again is that this information is super helpful for those.
Yeah, agility is key in all aspects of our supply chain these days. But you know, let's hope that as more and more people get vaccinated, and as the science gets better, I have a friend actually working on some stuff, you know, that's like chewable. So it's like a what is it, Thermaflu or something like that, where if you get COVID, you take something and then it lessens the impact. So we've got all this really great stuff happening. It's just right now things are a little bit problematic that might ding us, but hopefully we'll get through this. And of course, as FDRA, we'll continue to hopefully foster these conversations just like we do every Tuesday on our member calls, talk about these things more in depth to help share intelligence and what may happen that may impact us of our business. Again, shoeandshow.com is our website. You can go on and find the full list of all our conversations with footwear industry leaders and experts just like this. Anything and everything about footwear that impacts your business, those are the conversations we try to have. Please rate us. You can listen on Spotify, Apple. Tell your friends and colleagues about this podcast, because it's really all about helping sharpen the industry and strengthen the industry. And we appreciate you listening today. Any questions about the conversation that we had today, you can drop us a line at info@fdra.org or on shoeandshow.com. Bottom left side, there's a voice note. You click on the little button, you can leave us a message that you can pass along to us that we'll listen and try to respond to. But again, as always, thank you all for listening. And until next time, Shoe In is out.
Shoe In has been brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. For information about FDRA, visit fdra.org.